The cell smelled of rust and old rain, and Kieran Weiss had learned to measure time by the drip of water from the ceiling above his cot. Drip, drip, drip. Somewhere past the 40th drop of the hour, the guards would change, and for exactly 90 seconds, the eastern corridor would be empty. He had counted that gap for 6 days. Tonight, he would use it. The Valic Empire did not waste executioners on men like him. Men with no name worth remembering, no house, no god's favor. It wasted something far more efficient: the chalice. A single vial of pale violet liquid brewed in the temple's inner sanctum that the priests called Undying's Bane, the poison of the gods. It did not simply kill, it unmade. Men who drank it did not die screaming, they simply stopped mid-breath, as if some hand had reached into the world and erased them one heartbeat at a time. Kieran had seen it done once, in the square, to a merchant who had dared question a tax collector's math. That was the crime that earned a man Undying's Bane. Not treason, not murder. Inconvenience. He did not intend to become inconvenient enough to deserve it twice. The chain around his ankle was thin, temple-forged, meant to bind rather than merely restrain. But thin chains break the same as thick ones if you know where the weld is weakest. He'd found it on the third night, a hairline seam no wider than a fingernail, and he'd spent every night since working a sliver of stone against it in the dark. Tonight, it gave. The corridor was empty, just as he'd counted. He moved low along the wall, past the guard station where a half-eaten loaf of bread sat abandoned beside a lantern turned down to embers. His bare feet made no sound on the stone. He was 3 doors from the outer gate when he heard the footsteps, too fast, too many, coming from the wrong direction. They know. He didn't wait to find out how. He turned into the side passage, the one the guards used to move supplies, and found himself in a narrow storeroom lined with shelves of sealed jars, crates stamped with the temple's sunburst sigil, and, at the very back, resting alone on a pedestal shrouded in black cloth, a single vial of pale violet liquid, Undying's Bane, being moved, being stored here, of all nights, for some execution scheduled at dawn. The footsteps in the corridor grew louder. A voice barked an order. Torchlight flickered under the door. There was no other way out. Kieran's mind raced through the geometry of the room the way it always did in moments like this. A habit left over from a life he barely remembered. A life where thinking clearly was the only thing standing between him and dying stupidly. High window, too small. Vent shaft, too narrow. Door, guarded. The pedestal blocked a one gap in the shelving that might have let him squeeze through to the loading dock beyond. He needed the pedestal gone. He grabbed the vial to shove it aside, and his numb, chain-raw fingers, slick with the sweat of 6 days of fear, betrayed him. The stopper came free. The violet liquid arced through the air in a thin, glittering ribbon, and half of it went down his throat before he even understood what was happening. For one long moment, nothing happened at all. Then, the burning started. It was not like fire. Fire he could have understood. Fire was pain with an edge, something you could brace against. This was different. This was cold that burned, ice replacing his blood vein by vein, a sensation of being slowly subtracted from the inside out. He fell against the shelf, jars rattling, and somewhere very far away, he heard the door burst open and a guard's voice go high and thin with something that might have been horror. So this is how it ends, he thought, almost calm about it, the way a man is calm when there's truly nothing left to do. Not on a rack, not on a headsman's block, in a supply closet, by accident, like a fool. The cold reached his heart and stopped. It didn't fade, it didn't ease, it simply met something. Some wall inside him he hadn't known was there, some foundation laid down in a life before this one, in a body that no longer existed but had left its mark on the one he wore now. The poison pressed against that wall the way a wave presses against a cliff, and the wall did not move. Words bloomed across his vision, faint and gold, like something written on the inside of his own eyes. Foreign toxin detected. Undying's Bane. Analyzing. Analysis complete. Threat neutralized. System awakened. Absolute immunity. Immunity registered. Undying's Bane. Permanent. Kieran did not move. He could not have said, in that moment, whether he was breathing or not, whether the guards were still shouting, or whether the world had simply gone silent around the impossible thing happening in his chest. The cold receded like a tide going out, leaving behind not weakness, but a strange, humming clarity, as if every nerve in his body had been rinsed clean. He was alive. He should not have been alive. The guard in the doorway, a young one, barely past his boyhood, sword trembling in his hand, stared at him with the particular horror of a man watching a corpse refuse to fall down. That's the chalice. That's Undying's bane. You drank." "I did," Kieran said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. He looked down at his own hands, turning them over, half expecting to see them dissolving, ashing away. They didn't. They were just hands. Tired, chained, scarred, but his. More guards were arriving now, drawn by the shouting, and behind them, moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who never had to run, came a figure in violet robes trimmed with silver. A temple adept, the kind who oversaw executions to make sure the god's will was properly witnessed. The adept took one look at Kieran, standing upright, breathing, alive, and went the color of old parchment. "That is not possible," the adept said, very quietly, as if saying it softly might make it true. "No one survives the chalice. No one has ever survived the chalice." "Someone should tell the chalice that," Kieran said, and immediately regretted it because 11 armed men do not appreciate wit from a prisoner who has just broken several laws of nature in front of them. What followed was chaos of the useful kind. The adept, torn between reporting a miracle and reporting a catastrophe, hesitated exactly long enough for the young guard, the one who had looked at Kieran not with horror but with something dangerously close to awe, to step between him and the others. "If the god spared him," the boy said, "striking him down now would be blasphemy." It was, Kieran would later realize, the single most useful sentence anyone had ever said on his behalf, because it planted a seed of doubt that would follow him out of that storeroom, out of that fortress, and into every court and temple in the empire for months to come. What if this was not an accident, but a sign? He did not believe it himself. He knew exactly what had happened. Some old, buried inheritance of the body he now wore had simply refused to die. But belief was a currency other people spent freely, and in the confusion that followed, in the shouting and the arguing over whether to strike him down anyway or drag him before the high priestess for judgment, Kieran did the only sensible thing left to a man handed an unearned miracle. He ran. He went out through the loading dock, past crates and startled dockhands, over a low wall slick with night damp, and into the tangle of alleys behind the fortress district, and he did not stop running until the shouting behind him had faded into the ordinary noise of a city that did not yet know its gods had just been proven fallible. The city did not make his escape easy. Word traveled faster than his legs could carry him, and twice before dawn, he heard whistles cutting through the dark behind him, not the disciplined horns of temple guards, but the cruder signal calls of city watchmen who had clearly been given a description and a promise of coin. He ducked through a tanner's yard reeking of lime and old hides, waded knee-deep through a drainage culvert that ran black with the night's rain, and once, when a patrol rounded a corner directly into his path, pressed himself into the shadow of a shrine alcove and simply waited, heart hammering, while 2 guardsmen argued about whether the rumor of a man surviving the chalice was worth losing sleep over. "Priest business," one of them muttered, spitting into the gutter. "Let the violet robes chase their own miracles. I'm not risking my neck for a ghost story." Kieran let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding once their footsteps faded, and allowed himself, for the first time since the storeroom, a single thought that was not purely tactical. I am still here. Somehow, impossibly, I am still here. It was not relief, exactly. Relief implied the danger was past, and he understood well enough that it had barely begun. It was something closer to the strange, vertiginous clarity of a man who has fallen from a great height and, against every law he understood about the world, landed standing. He found shelter before dawn in the collapsed husk of an old grain warehouse, half its roof caved in from some fire decades past, its beams black and skeletal against the paling sky. Rats scattered as he pushed through a gap in the boarded door, and the smell of mildew and old grain dust settled over him like a second skin as he sank down against a support pillar, finally letting his exhaustion catch up to the adrenaline that had carried him this far. There, finally alone, finally still, he allowed himself to look inward at the strange golden text still hovering faintly at the edge of his vision. Absolute immunity. Function: upon first exposure to any toxin, disease, curse, or debilitating effect, permanent immunity is registered. Subsequent exposure to a registered threat produces no effect. Immunities registered. 1. Undying's Bane, neutralized. Kieran stared at the words for a long time, turning them over the way he'd once turned a stone against a chain, patiently, looking for the weakness, the trick, the price he would inevitably have to pay for something this valuable. He found none, just the fact of it, plain and gold in the dark. He had drunk a poison that unmade men, and it had not unmade him. He thought of the boy guard's words, a sign. He thought of the adept's face, ash-white with a fear too large for words. He thought, with the particular exhaustion of a man who has survived one impossible night, only to realize it is merely the first of many, that whatever he had just become, the world was not going to let him become it quietly. He tried, in the gray hour before true dawn, to remember more of the life that had apparently left this strange inheritance behind. The memories came in fragments, disjointed and stubborn, refusing to arrange themselves into anything as tidy as a name or a history. The sensation of a body pushed past every reasonable limit, again and again, until endurance itself became something closer to instinct than choice. A discipline of some kind, a price paid, somewhere, for a strength that had outlived the person who'd earned it. He could not have said whether that life had ended in triumph or ruin, only that whatever had happened to him then had apparently mattered enough to survive the transition into a body and a world that owed it nothing. It was not comforting, exactly, to have half a truth instead of none, but it was something to hold on to, in a warehouse that smelled of mildew, with a bounty surely already forming on his head, and a golden ledger of impossible survival glowing faintly behind his eyes. He slept, eventually, despite himself, curled against the pillar with the boarded door barred by a fallen beam he'd dragged across it, and in that thin, exhausted sleep, he dreamed, not clearly, never clearly, but in fragments sharp enough to leave a residue behind when he woke. A vast, gray expanse, cold in a way that had nothing to do with weather, a weight pressing down on him from every direction at once, endured rather than escaped. For a length of time his dreaming mind refused to measure in anything as small as days or years. And beneath it all, a single, stubborn certainty that had apparently followed him across whatever boundaries separated that life from this one. You do not get to decide when I stop. He woke with the words still echoing somewhere behind his ribs, uncertain whether they belonged to a memory or simply to whatever the golden system had built out of one, and found he no longer had the luxury of wondering which. Sunlight was already leaking through the gaps in the warehouse roof, dust motes drifting gold in the beams, and somewhere outside, the ordinary noise of a city waking to its ordinary business was rising to meet a day that would be, for him, anything but. By the time the sun cleared the rooftops, the story had already begun to outrun him. A dock worker who'd glimpsed him vaulting the loading yard wall told 3 friends, embellishing the height of the wall with each retelling. A guard, too frightened of his captain's wrath to admit the prisoner had simply walked free, instead invented a tale of vanishing smoke and glowing eyes. By midday, the noodle vendors and gutter runners of the lower city had already given the rumor a name that would follow Kieran far longer than he wanted it to. The Deathless Man. Some said it with fear. A surprising number said it was something closer to hope. The particular, dangerous hope of people who have spent their whole lives being reminded that the God's justice falls only ever downward, never up, and who had just heard, for the first time, that perhaps it could fail. Outside, the first bell of dawn began to ring across the rooftops of the city, and somewhere in the temple's inner sanctum, a high priestess was waking to news that would make her question everything she had built her faith upon. Chapter 2. The Alchemist's Curiosity. Lyra Aswin had built her reputation on three things: her unmatched skill at reading poison in blood, her refusal to marry into any of the four houses that kept proposing to her laboratory instead of to her, and her complete inability to leave an interesting problem alone once it crossed her doorstep. The rumor crossed her doorstep on the second morning after the escape, carried by a runner from the Apothecaries Guild who was still slightly out of breath from repeating it 4 times already that hour. "A prisoner drank the chalice," the runner said, "and walked out of the fortress on his own 2 feet. Lyra did not look up from the crucible she was tending, in which a shard of moonstone was slowly dissolving into a solution the color of a bruise. People say a great many things about the chalice. Most of them are theater dressed up as miracle. The temple's own adept confirmed it, my lady, before they silenced him for it. That got her attention. Lyra set down her tongs. She had not always been the kind of woman who chased rumors into noodle stalls. 10 years ago, she had been a promising apprentice at the Apothecaries Guild, favored to inherit a senior seat, until she'd made the mistake of publishing a paper questioning why the temple's official formulary listed no known antidote for Undying's Bane when every other toxin in the Empire's history had eventually yielded one to careful enough study. The paper had cost her the seat, cost her 2 years of professional standing, and taught her, in the particular bitter way such lessons are taught, exactly how much of what passed for settled truth in this empire was simply doctrine wearing the costume of fact. She had rebuilt her reputation since then, through sheer competence rather than favor, and she had never once stopped wondering, in some quiet corner of her mind, whether her long-dead paper had actually been right. She had spent 11 years studying Undying's Bane, not the finished poison itself, which was forbidden to handle outside temple walls, but its shadow, the residues left in the blood of the condemned, the way it interacted with warding sigils, the theoretical chemistry a woman could reconstruct from banned texts and careful bribery. She knew, with the particular certainty of someone who has tested a thing from every angle available to her, that Undying's Bane did not have an antidote. It did not have a resistance. It was built deliberately at the foundation of its formula to defeat every known ward, every known cleansing rite, every trick the human body or human magic had ever devised against poison. For a man to survive it was not merely rare, it was, as far as her considerable expertise could determine, impossible. Which meant either the runner was wrong, the temple was lying for reasons of its own, or something existed that her 11 years of study had never accounted for. She went looking for him herself, which was, in retrospect, not the wisest decision she had ever made, but Lyra had never let wisdom slow her down when curiosity was driving. Kieran had not intended to be found. He had spent 2 days moving through the lower city in borrowed clothes, sleeping in doorways, eating what coin he'd stolen could buy, trying to work out a plan that did not end with him back in a temple cell or worse. But a man who has just proven the god's own weapon fallible does not stay unremarkable for long, and by the 3rd day, half the lower city was whispering about the deathless man, and the other half was arguing about whether that was a blessing or a heresy waiting to be corrected. He was in a noodle stall near the tannery district, keeping his head down, when a woman in a soot-stained alchemist's coat sat down across from him without invitation and set a small brass instrument on the table between them. "Give me your hand," she said, as if this were a perfectly normal opening to a conversation with a stranger. "I don't believe we've met." "We haven't. I'm Lyra. You're either the man who survived the chalice or an extraordinarily convincing liar, and I intend to find out which before I finish my tea." She tapped the brass instrument. "This reads toxin residue in blood. It doesn't lie, and it doesn't care about your feelings on the matter. Give me your hand. Or don't. But if you don't, I'm going to assume you're lying and tell everyone in this stall exactly that." Kieran looked at her for a long moment. The steady eyes, the ink-stained fingers, the complete absence of fear that every other person in this city seemed to carry around him now like a shield. There was something almost restful about being looked at as a problem rather than as an omen. He gave her his hand. The instrument hummed, its needle twitching once, twice, and then settling into a reading that made Lyra go very still. "There's residue," she said slowly. "Undying's Bane, unmistakably. But it's inert, dormant, as if your blood simply decided the poison wasn't worth reacting to anymore. She looked up at him, and for the first time since sitting down, some of her clinical certainty cracked into something more like wonder. "Do you have any idea what you are?" "A man trying to eat his noodles in peace," Kieran said. "You're a walking contradiction of 11 years of my research, is what you are." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Do you understand what that poison is built to do? It doesn't just kill. It's designed to defeat anything the body or magic could throw against it. There is no antidote. There has never been an antidote. And yet, here you sit. Congratulations on the discovery. I'd prefer you kept it quiet." "I'd prefer to understand it," Lyra said, "which is a considerably more interesting goal than either of ours dying, which is what will happen to both of us if the temple finds you before I've had a chance to study this properly." Kieran set down his chopsticks. "You want to study my blood. I want to know how you survive something that shouldn't be survivable. Call it professional obsession if you'd like something less alarming to call it." She said it plainly, without artifice, the way a woman states a fact rather than pitches a favor. "I'm not interested in turning you over to the temple if that's your worry. I'm interested in the how. The temple would burn the answer along with you rather than let it exist in the world. I'd rather write it down." It was, Kieran thought, either the most honest thing anyone had said to him in years or an extremely elaborate trap. He had learned in his short and complicated life that the two were not always distinguishable. But he had also learned that a woman offering shelter, resources, and genuine curiosity instead of worship or fear was a rarer creature than any poison and worth more caution to lose than to keep. "If I let you study this," he said, "I want something in return, somewhere to sleep that isn't a doorway, information about what's actually being said about me in the city, and your word that whatever you learn doesn't end up in a temple report." "Done," Lyra said, with the speed of someone who had already decided the terms before she sat down and was merely enjoying the theater of negotiating them. "I have a laboratory 2 streets from here that the temple has no authority to search. Old guild charter, older than half their sanctums. You'll be safer there than anywhere else in this city." The laboratory turned out to be a converted bathhouse, all cracked tile and repurposed pipework, smelling of sulfur and dried herbs, and, underneath it, faintly, of ambition. Lyra put him to work almost immediately, not as a subject exactly, though the constant tests certainly felt like it, but as a kind of collaborator, peppering him with questions about what he felt, what he remembered, whether the golden words he described appearing in his vision had a pattern to them. "A system," she murmured, writing rapidly in a ledger already half filled with diagrams of his blood under different reagents. "Not magic exactly, not divine gift either. So I've read the liturgies on divine blessing, and they don't behave like this. This is closer to a mechanism, something built into you, or built onto you, that catalogs threats and disarms them permanently. Does it matter what it's called? It matters enormously," she said, not looking up. "Because if it's a mechanism, it can be understood. And if it can be understood, it might be replicated. Or at the very least, it tells me something true about how the world actually works, instead of the version the temple has spent 3 centuries insisting on." She glanced at him, sharp and assessing. "You said you registered immunity to the chalice specifically. Does it apply only to that poison or to poison generally?" Kieran considered the golden text still faintly present at the edge of his awareness. "I don't know. I've only been exposed once." "Then we test it," Lyra said, already reaching for a locked cabinet of carefully labeled vials, each one considerably less legendary than Undying's Bane, but still, by any sane measure, capable of killing a man several times over. "Carefully, starting with something survivable if I'm wrong." It was, Kieran reflected as she selected the first vial with the gleeful precision of a woman who had waited 11 years for exactly this kind of morning, either going to be the beginning of an extraordinary partnership or the second time in 1 week he nearly died by his own poor choices. Lyra's junior assistant, a quick, perpetually ink-stained girl named Pell, who had apprenticed under her for 2 years, took considerably longer to warm to the strange house guest than her mistress had. She spent the first several days regarding Kieran with the flat suspicion of someone who had watched her mentor make exactly 1 too many reckless decisions in the name of a good discovery, and who fully expected this one to end with either a temple raid or a body in the drainage canal. "You do know," Pell said to him on the third day while carefully labeling a fresh set of vials, that everyone who's ever gotten close to her research eventually gets used up by it. Not maliciously, she just forgets there's a person attached to the interesting problem sometimes. I've noticed the tendency, Kieran said. Good, someone should keep track of it besides me. Pell set the last vial down with more force than necessary. I'm not saying don't trust her. I'm saying don't be surprised, later, when you realize how much of this was always at least a little bit about the discovery first and the man second. She'd tell you the same if you asked her plainly enough. It was, Kieran thought, an oddly protective warning from a girl who'd spent 3 days looking at him like he might detonate, and he found himself, against his usual caution, rather liking her for it. He drank the first vial. Foreign toxin detected. Bloomrack extract. Immunity registered. Bloomrack extract. Permanent. He felt nothing but the faint, cold, then clarity sensation he now recognized, and across the table, Lyra's face broke into an expression he would come to know well over the following weeks, the specific, unguarded delight of a scholar watching a law of nature quietly rewrite itself in front of her. Again, she said, already reaching for the next vial. The work was not without its complications. On the 5th day, a senior guild inspector arrived unannounced to review Lyra's stores, a routine visit that nearly turned catastrophic when the man's inventory count came up several vials short of what her ledgers claimed remained. Kieran spent an uncomfortable hour folded into a false-bottomed storage chest, usually reserved for the laboratory's more legally ambiguous acquisitions, listening to Lyra talk the inspector in slow, patient circles about evaporation rates and clerical error, until the man finally left, satisfied enough not to escalate the matter, but clearly unconvinced he'd been told the whole truth. That was closer than I would have liked, Kieran said, once the door had safely shut behind the inspector's retreating footsteps. That was Tuesday, Lyra said, already back to her ledger as if the near discovery of a fugitive in her storage chest were simply the ordinary cost of doing business. You get used to it. Or you don't, and you find a different laboratory to hide in. I'd prefer the former, personally. You're the most interesting thing to happen to my research in a decade, and I'm not inclined to lose you to an inspector's paperwork. There was, beneath the clinical bravado, a genuine warmth that Kieran had not expected to find in a woman who'd first approached him as a data point rather than a person. It showed itself in small ways. The extra blanket she left without comment on the cot she'd set up for him in the laboratory's back room. The way she'd started asking not just what he felt when a new immunity registered, but how he was sleeping, whether the golden system text gave him headaches, whether he wanted to talk about the life he could only half remember, or would rather she stopped asking. He found himself, against every instinct toward caution he'd built over weeks of running, beginning to trust her, not blindly, but in the careful, incremental way a man learns to trust anyone who has proven, day after day, that her curiosity and his survival were pointed in the same direction. "Why does this matter so much to you?" he asked her one evening, after the day's testing had run long and the laboratory's mage lamps had burned low. "Beyond the professional obsession, you could have handed me to the guild the first day and built a career on the discovery alone. Instead, you've hidden a fugitive, lied to an inspector, and spent a small fortune in reagents on a man you'd known for less than a week." Lyra considered the question with more seriousness than he expected, setting down her quill. "Because for 10 years I've watched this empire tell its people that some truths are settled, some doctrines beyond question, and anyone who says otherwise deserves whatever ruin follows. You are the first proof I've ever had, in 10 years of looking, that they were wrong about at least one of those truths." She met his eyes, steady and unguarded in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. "I'd burn considerably more than a small fortune in reagents to make sure that proof doesn't disappear before the world has to reckon with it." By the time the guards found their first solid lead on the deathless man's location 3 days later, Kieran Vase had already survived 11 separate poisons, 2 minor curses borrowed from a disgraced hedge witch's collection, and 1 extremely persistent case of Lyra's growing conviction that whatever he was, the temple's monopoly on miracles had just developed a very inconvenient crack. Chapter 3. The Princess and the Assassin. The invitation came, absurdly, on temple stationery, which was how Kieran knew immediately that something had gone very wrong, or very right, in a way that would complicate his life considerably either way. "They want you at the Autumn Accord," Lyra said, turning the paper over as if a second look might reveal it to be a forgery. It wasn't. The wax seal was genuine, the calligraphy unmistakably the High Chancellor's own hand. "It's the biggest diplomatic gathering of the year. Half the nobility of the empire will be there, and apparently, so will you. I don't recall requesting an invitation to anything, let alone a gathering hosted by the people trying to kill me." "They're not inviting the man who escaped a temple cell," Lyra said. "They're inviting the Deathless Man. There's a difference, and it's the difference between a fugitive and a curiosity the empire wants to examine up close before the temple decides what to do with you." She set the invitation down. Refusing would be its own kind of statement. Attending, carefully, might buy you protection you can't get any other way. The empire and the temple don't love each other nearly as much as they pretend to for the peasants' benefit. It was, Kieran reflected, exactly the kind of trap dressed as an opportunity that he'd learned to be suspicious of in his old life. But Lyra was not wrong that hiding forever was not a strategy so much as a slow surrender. And there was something to be said for meeting your enemies in a room with too many witnesses for anyone to simply make you disappear. He went. The accord was held in the Empire's Sunfall Hall, a cavernous space of gold-veined marble and floating mage lights, crowded with nobles who had perfected the art of staring at someone without appearing to look at them at all. Kieran felt every one of those glances like a physical weight as he crossed the floor in borrowed finery that fit him only approximately, Lyra a careful half-step behind him, murmuring names and alliances under her breath like a woman narrating a battlefield. He spent the first half-hour simply surviving the introductions, a parade of barons and guildmasters and minor temple functionaries, each one measuring him with the particular calculating glance of someone deciding whether he was worth an alliance, a bribe, or a knife in a dark corridor later that evening. Lyra steered him deftly through the worst of it, murmuring context just quickly enough for him to avoid outright insult, that House Draven had lost a fortune betting against the Empire's grain tariffs and would want him as a distraction from their debts, that the cluster of violet-robed delegates by the Western Pillar represented the more moderate wing of the temple, cautiously curious rather than hostile, that the old woman in unadorned gray, watching him with eyes far sharper than her plain dress suggested, was the Empress's own spy master and worth avoiding entirely if he valued keeping his secrets his own. "Everyone in this hall wants something from you already," Lyra murmured, "and you haven't said a single word to any of them yet. Imagine how much worse it gets once you do." A comforting thought. Thank you. He did not expect to end up at the center of an actual crisis within the hour. Most men who wanted to avoid trouble did not, as a rule, walk directly toward the sound of someone choking. It happened near the refreshment table. A young woman in imperial violet, crowned with the narrow circlet that marked her as one of the Empire's own bloodline, suddenly doubling over, a goblet shattering against marble, her attendants shrieking for a physician who was 3 rooms away and would arrive far too late. Kieran was closer. He didn't think. He crossed the distance in a few long strides, caught her before she hit the floor, and did the only thing that made any sense to a man who had spent the last several weeks systematically drinking poison for a living. He pressed his palm to the join of her jaw, tilted her head, and forced 2 fingers into her mouth to clear her airway before the convulsion could close it. "What are you doing?" someone shouted. "Saving her life if everyone would kindly stop screaming," Kieran snapped, and something in his voice, flat, certain, entirely unimpressed by titles, cut through the panic enough that the crowd actually gave him room. The princess, because that was unmistakably what she was, up close. The imperial features, unmistakable even twisted in pain, was seizing, her lips already going the faint blue-gray of a nerve poison working fast. Kieran recognized the presentation immediately. Lyra had walked him through nearly identical symptoms 3 days prior, using a diluted sample of exactly this kind of toxin. There was only one treatment fast enough to matter, and it was not a treatment at all. "I need you to trust me," he said to her, though she was well past hearing him, and did the thing that would either save her life or make him look like a madman assaulting imperial royalty in front of half the court. He pressed his own wrist, freshly nicked with the belt knife every fugitive learns to keep close, against her lips. His blood carries active antibodies to nearly every known toxin, Lyra said loudly, appearing at his shoulder exactly when her voice was needed most, projecting the kind of unshakable clinical authority that made panicking nobles listen. It's the fastest counteragent in this hall, and every moment you spend debating it is a moment she doesn't have. It was not strictly a lie. The alchemist had theorized as much and simply never had cause to test it under this much pressure. Kieran felt the golden system text flicker faintly at the edge of his vision as some fraction of what ran in his veins passed to hers, and a long, terrible moment stretched out in which absolutely nothing happened. Then the princess's convulsions eased, her breathing steadied, color crept back into lips that had gone the color of old ash. She opened her eyes and found herself staring directly up into the face of the man the entire empire had spent the last month whispering about. "You," she said, voice a thin rasp, "are the Deathless Man." "Currently the man who just bled on imperial silk without permission," Kieran said. "I apologize for the informality." Her name, he would learn within the hour, was Selena Varion, third in line for the imperial throne, and, as it turned out, the specific target of an assassination attempt 3 separate factions would later claim credit for, each with equally unconvincing evidence. The poison in her wine had been slow-acting, subtle, meant to look like natural collapse rather than murder. A temple-grade toxin, according to the physicians who arrived far too late to be useful, of a type not sold in any legal apothecary in the capital, which meant someone with temple access had wanted a Varion princess dead, quietly, at an event meant to showcase imperial temple cooperation. Kieran did not love the timing. He was given, for his trouble, a guest suite in the palace wing reserved for honored visitors, a physician's examination he tolerated with poor grace, and, several hours later, once the chaos had settled into the particular quiet of a scandal being actively suppressed, a visit from the princess herself, dressed down from her court finery into something plainer, her guards left pointedly outside the door. "You saved my life in front of 200 witnesses," Selena said without preamble, settling into the chair across from him with the exhausted precision of someone who had spent the last several hours being managed by advisors rather than allowed to simply feel what had happened to her. "That makes you either the most valuable ally I could ask for, or the most convenient scapegoat if anyone decides to claim you poisoned me yourself to seem the hero. An uplifting set of options." "I don't think you did it," she said. "I think whoever did wanted me dead specifically at an event with temple delegates present, so the blame would fall on imperial rivals instead of the temple itself. It's tidy. It's the kind of tidy I've learned to distrust." She studied him, not with the awe he'd grown used to from strangers on the street, nor the clinical fascination Lyra wore like a second skin, but something more careful, more assessing. "You're not what the rumors describe, you know. They say you're either a saint blessed by the gods or a monster who cheated them. You're neither. You're just a man who happened to be standing closer than anyone else when I needed one. I've found that's usually the most useful thing a person can be." Selena almost smiled at that, the first genuine expression he'd seen cross her face since she'd woken. "My family will want to use you. I want you to know that plainly, since no one else in this palace will bother to be honest with you about it." The Deathless Man, walking proof the temple's ultimate weapon can fail. That's not a curiosity to my grandmother, the Empress. That's a piece on a board she's been playing for 30 years. She leaned forward. "I'd rather you knew that from me than discovered it from someone with worse intentions." "And what do you want from me?" Kieran asked, "beyond the obvious debt for tonight. Right now, nothing you haven't already given me." She stood, smoothing her sleeve over the faint mark on her wrist where his blood had passed to hers, an intimacy neither of them had chosen, but both would carry regardless. "But I'd remember if I were you, that being useful to the Empire and being safe from it are not the same thing. Choose your allies carefully, Kieran Vase. Not everyone who smiles at you in this palace intends you well. and I include some of my own family in that warning." She left him with that, and Kieran sat alone in a borrowed room in the heart of an empire that had just decided he was worth keeping close, turning her warning over in his mind alongside the golden system text still faintly glowing at the edge of his vision. Immunity registered. Night Shroud venom. Permanent. The investigation that followed the accord was conducted with the particular quiet urgency of an empire desperate to avoid a public scandal. The Imperial spy master in gray, the one Lyra had warned him about, questioned Kieran personally the following morning, her manner courteous, but her eyes missing nothing. And though she seemed satisfied he'd had no hand in the poisoning, she made it clear, in the careful diplomatic language of someone accustomed to threats disguised as pleasantries, that his continued presence in the capital would be watched closely regardless. "You understand," she said, "that a man capable of surviving what should have killed a princess outright is either the Empire's greatest asset or its most dangerous liability, depending entirely on which faction ends up controlling him. I would advise you to decide, sooner rather than later, which side of that line you intend to stand on, because others will decide it for you if you don't." Kieran insisted, against the spy master's initial objection, on being present when the captured wine steward's known associate, a minor court functionary with gambling debts deep enough to make him an easy recruit for anyone with coin and patience, was formally questioned. The man was terrified, well past the point of useful composure, and it took the spy master's carefully measured patience, rather than any threat, to draw out the little he actually knew. A contact who paid in temple-minted coin, instructions delivered through a third party whose face he'd never seen, and a payment schedule structured specifically to survive discovery of any single link in the chain. "Professional," the spy master said afterward, in the clipped tone of someone cataloging a familiar pattern rather than discovering a new one. "Compartmentalized precisely enough that no single arrest unravels the whole. Whoever ordered this has done it before, and expects to do it again." "That's not comforting," Kieran said. "It isn't meant to be. It's meant to tell you exactly how careful you'll need to remain." She studied him with the same assessing patience she'd shown from their first meeting. "Whoever wanted the princess dead is still out there, still funded, and now considerably more aware that you exist and that you interfere with their plans. I would not assume tonight was their only attempt at anything." The wine steward who had served the poisoned goblet was found 3 days later, dead in his own quarters, in a manner made to look like a guilty man's suicide, but bearing, to Lyra's practiced eye, the unmistakable signs of a professional silencing, rather than genuine remorse. Whoever had ordered Selena's death had not hesitated to spend a second life covering the trail of the first, which told Kieran, more clearly than any court whisper could, exactly how seriously his new enemies took the stakes of being caught. Selena herself seemed to age years in the days following the attempt, the careful diplomatic mask she wore in public slipping, in their private conversations, into something more tired and more honest. "There are perhaps 6 people in this palace I would trust with my life without hesitation," she told him, during one of the quiet evenings she'd taken to spending in the modest chambers he'd been given, well away from the pomp of the honored guest wing. "You are, against every reasonable expectation, rapidly becoming a 7th. I find that both a comfort and a considerable inconvenience, given how thoroughly it complicates my family's plans for you. 12 immunities now, and a princess who owed him her life, and somewhere in this palace, someone who had wanted her dead and would not be pleased to learn she'd survived." He had a feeling the autumn accord was only the beginning. Chapter 4. The Priestess of Miracles. High Priestess Anya Solren had served the temple for 31 years, and in that time she had witnessed exactly 4 events she privately classified as true miracles. Moments where the divine had reached down and rearranged the world in a way no doctrine, no ritual, no careful theological argument could fully explain. The deathless man made 5. Inquisitor Halvern had built his entire career on the doctrine of the chalice's perfection. He had joined the temple as a boy from the border provinces with nothing to his name but conviction, and had risen through 3 decades of service by making himself the sternest, most reliable enforcer of the belief that the God's judgment, once passed, could never be wrong. He had personally overseen 11 executions by Undying's bane, had stood witness each time with the calm certainty of a man watching justice done exactly as it should be, and had built, brick by careful brick, a reputation as the temple's most unshakable voice of orthodoxy. A single survivor did not merely embarrass him. It threatened to unmake the entire foundation his authority stood upon, and Ania had known him long enough to understand that a man who had built his whole life on a doctrine would not surrender it quietly, whatever the evidence demanded. She had not believed the reports at first. Reports of survived executions were, in her considerable experience, almost always explained by bribery, substitution, or some mundane trick dressed up as wonder by people who wanted to believe in something larger than tax collectors and bad harvests. She had sent her most trusted adept to investigate specifically because she expected to find fraud and had been prepared to quietly correct the record and move on. Instead, her adept had returned pale, shaking, and utterly unable to explain what he'd witnessed, except to say, over and over, that the man had simply not died, and that the chalice that had ended 43 lives in her tenure alone, that had never once failed to do exactly what the gods intended it to do, had done nothing at all. Anya had spent 3 sleepless nights afterward, praying in the inner sanctum with a fervor she hadn't needed since her novice years, asking a question she had never once had cause to ask before. What if the chalice was never truly the god's will, but merely dressed up to look like it? It was not a question the temple encouraged its priestesses to ask aloud. She asked to meet him anyway. The meeting was arranged with more diplomatic care than either side particularly wanted to admit. A private audience in a temple annex chosen specifically for its neutrality, Lyra present at Kieran's insistence, 2 of Anya's most trusted, and least political, attendants present at hers. Anya had expected, going in, to find either a fraud clever enough to fool an entire fortress, or a man twisted by whatever dark bargain had granted him his impossible survival. She found instead a tired young man with careful eyes, who watched her the way a soldier watches a superior officer whose orders might get him killed, respectful, wary, giving nothing away for free. "You wish to see me," Kieran said, "though I confess I expected the meeting to involve considerably more shouting, given what your temple generally does with people like me." "What the temple does," Ania said, "is not always the same as what I believe the gods intend. I've spent 3 decades serving a faith built partly on the assumption that Undying's Bane is an instrument of divine judgment, incapable of error, because to err would mean it was never truly divine to begin with." She folded her hands, an old habit from a lifetime of careful diplomacy. "You are, quite inconveniently, evidence that it can err. I would like to understand how, before I decide what that means for everything else I've built my life upon." It was a more honest opening than Kieran had expected from anyone wearing the temple's violet, and he found himself, against his better instincts, answering with something closer to the truth than he usually allowed himself with strangers. "I don't fully understand it myself," he admitted. "Something in me, call it a mechanism, a gift, an accident of birth, I genuinely don't know which, refuses to let poison, disease, or curse take hold a second time once it's met them once. I didn't ask for it. I didn't earn it through any faith or bargain I'm aware of. It simply exists in me, the way some men are born left-handed or colorblind. An accident then, not a blessing. I couldn't tell you which the gods would call it," Kieran said. "I only know which it feels like to me, which is neither. Honestly, it feels like a tool, useful, dangerous to the wrong people, not sacred, whatever your chalice was built to be." Anya was quiet for a long moment, studying him with the particular intensity of a woman recalculating 3 decades of certainty in real time. "Do you know what happens to a faith when its central proof of divine justice turns out to be fallible, Kieran Vase? I imagine it either breaks, or it finds a new proof to replace the old one. Precisely the 2 options that terrify me equally," Anya said, with a dry, unexpected humor that suggested she had already spent considerable private time terrified by exactly this question. "There are factions within my own temple who would rather you simply cease to exist than force that reckoning. Inquisitor Halvern, chief among them. He spent his career enforcing the doctrine of the chalice's infallibility, and a man like you is not a curiosity to him. You're an execution warrant he hasn't yet been permitted to sign. And you? I haven't decided yet whether you're a miracle sent to correct my faith, or simply a mortal anomaly that will get us both killed by people less inclined to ask questions than I am? Ania rose, smoothing her robes with the same careful precision she brought to every public gesture. But I find, against 30 years of training, that I would rather understand the truth than protect a comfortable lie built on top of it. That makes me dangerous to my own temple, Kirin Weiss, in ways I suspect you understand better than most. In the days that followed their first meeting, Ania made a habit of summoning him to the temple annex under increasingly thin pretexts, and Kirin, against every instinct that told him to stay as far from temple ground as possible, kept accepting. There was something he had not expected to find in her company, not the awe of the crowds, not the calculation of the court, but a genuine, searching curiosity from a woman old enough and secure enough in her own authority to risk asking dangerous questions out loud. "Tell me honestly," she said during one such meeting, "do you believe in anything? Gods, fate, purpose, any of it? I find I'm curious what a man makes of the universe once he's proven its most feared instrument fallible." "I believe in surviving until tomorrow," Kirin said. "Beyond that, I try not to commit to opinions the universe might feel obligated to correct." A survivor's philosophy, practical, if a little bleak. Anya studied him with the same careful attention she brought to reading scripture for hidden meaning. "I envy it, some days. My faith was never optional the way yours seems to be. I was raised inside it, shaped by it, and now I find myself questioning its foundations at an age when most women my age are settling comfortably into certainty rather than abandoning it." She paused. "Halvern would call that weakness. I've begun to wonder if it isn't simply honesty, arriving later than it should have." It was in the warmth of that growing candor, dangerous, unhurried, entirely unlike the wary transactions that defined most of Kirin's other relationships in this city, that the attack, when it came, felt like a particularly cruel betrayal of the fragile trust being built in that annex. The warning proved prophetic within the week. Inquisitor Halvern was not a man given to subtlety once his patience expired, and his patience, thin to begin with where doctrine was concerned, had run out entirely the moment the High Priestess began openly questioning the chalice's infallibility in closed council sessions. He moved the way men like him always moved, through proxies, through plausible deniability, through the kind of violence that could later be blamed on bandits or rival houses or simple bad luck. The attack came at dusk, 3 streets from Lyra's laboratory, 4 men in unmarked leathers who knew exactly which alley had no witnesses and exactly how long the local watch took to respond to trouble in that district. They were good, professional, disciplined, clearly not amateurs hired off the street, but they had made the same mistake every attacker had made since the storeroom in the fortress. They had planned for a man who could be killed by ordinary means. The first blade that found his side should have opened an artery. It found instead a body that no longer registered the poison coating its edge, and while the wound itself still bled, immunity was not invulnerability. Kirin had learned that distinction the hard way in Lyra's careful testing. The numbing agent meant to drop him in seconds simply failed to take hold at all. Widow's kiss. Immunity registered. Widow's kiss. Permanent. He fought through the pain rather than collapsing beneath it, which was apparently not in anyone's plan, and by the time the watch finally arrived, drawn by the noise, 2 attackers were down, 1 had fled, and the 4th was pinned beneath Kirin's knee, very much alive and very much willing to talk once it became clear that the alternative was considerably less pleasant. The confession, extracted more through fear than force, named no one directly. Professionals rarely knew who truly employed them. But the poison on the blades was traced, 3 days later, through careful and quiet analysis in Lyra's laboratory, to a compound found nowhere outside restricted temple stores. Anya received the report with the particular stillness of a woman watching her worst fear confirmed in writing. "Halvern," she said, to no one in particular, staring at Lyra's analysis until the ink seemed to blur. "He didn't even wait for permission from the council. What happens now?" Kirin asked. Now, Anya said, setting the report down with the careful control of someone containing a great deal of anger, I have proof that a senior inquisitor of my own temple attempted murder against a man I have not yet ruled a heretic, using poison stolen from stores meant for sanctioned executions alone. That is not a doctrinal disagreement anymore, Kiran Weiss. That is a crime I can bring before the full council, regardless of what any of them believe about your existence. Her expression hardened into something that looked less like a priestess and more like a woman who had finally found the leverage she needed. It seems, quite against his intentions, Halvern has just handed me exactly the reckoning I needed to force this conversation into the open. Halvern himself, when the formal summons reached him, received it with the particular stillness of a man recalculating a battle he had assumed already won. He had spent 30 years believing that conviction, applied with enough force and enough patience, eventually overcame any obstacle placed before it, and he was not, even now, prepared to accept that a single failed ambush and one alchemist's careful analysis could undo 3 decades of unquestioned authority. He burned the summons in his private hearth that night, not out of any illusion that doing so would make it disappear, but because he needed, before facing the council, to feel for a moment that he still controlled something. Let them hold their hearing, he told the 1/8 he still trusted completely, a younger inquisitor who had risen through the ranks under his direct patronage. Doctrine does not bend because a council grows frightened of an anomaly. If they will not act to correct this heresy, I will find allies who understand what is truly at stake, even if I must look beyond this council to find them. It was, though neither Ania nor Kiran would learn of it for some time yet, the first quiet step toward a fracture that would eventually reach far beyond the walls of a single temple council chamber. 13 immunities now, a princess's gratitude, an alchemist's growing devotion to a mystery she was determined to solve, and now a high priestess willing to turn her own temple's doctrine against itself. That night, alone in the small room Lyra had given over to him in the laboratory, Kiran turned the day's events over in his mind with the same patient care he'd once used to work a sliver of stone against a chain. Ania's counsel had given him something he hadn't expected to find in the city. Not safety, which he'd learned by now to distrust as a permanent state, but the first genuine ally within the temple's own walls. A woman risking her entire life's work on the possibility that his existence meant something worth protecting rather than erasing. He thought of Halvern's face in the moment the guard had reported the failed ambush. Not the report itself, which he hadn't witnessed, but the accounts that had reached him secondhand, of an inquisitor who had received the news not with alarm, but with the cold, methodical recalculation of a man already planning his next move. That kind of conviction did not break simply because a single attempt failed. It adapted. It found new methods, new allies, new justifications for the same unshaken certainty. Kiran understood that kind of opponent better than he understood almost anything else about this world. He had, after all, spent a lifetime he could barely remember learning exactly how dangerous, unshakable conviction could be when it decided you were the obstacle standing between it and its version of the truth. Kiran was beginning to understand that surviving the poison had been the easy part. Surviving everyone's plans for what his survival meant was going to be considerably harder. Chapter 5. The Registry of Immunity. The council chamber beneath the temple's inner sanctum had not seen open conflict between its ranking priests in over a century, and Ania Salrin intended to make certain that history remembered exactly why this occasion broke that streak. She had spent the 2 nights before the hearing preparing not just her evidence, but herself, aware that whatever she said in that chamber would follow her for the rest of her career, regardless of the outcome. 31 years of careful, patient service to an institution she had genuinely believed in, and now she stood at the threshold of publicly accusing one of its most senior enforcers of a crime that struck at the doctrine's very foundation. There would be no quiet way back from this, whichever way the council ruled. She had made her peace with that the previous evening, alone in the inner sanctum, in a prayer that had felt, for the first time in years, less like recitation and more like an honest conversation with whatever might actually be listening. She stood before the assembled council, 7 elders in violet and gold, Inquisitor Halvern among them, his composure only slightly frayed at the edges, and laid out the evidence with the precision of a woman who had spent 30 years learning exactly how to make an argument that could not be dismissed. The poison traced to restricted stores, the attack 3 streets from a known residence, the absence of any council sanction for an execution attempt against a man never formally charged with heresy. "You accuse me," Halvern said, "on the word of an alchemist of questionable loyalty and a man whose very existence threatens the foundation of our faith." "I accuse you," Aeneas said, "on the word of a captured attacker, a poison analysis that cannot be forged, and a restricted store ledger that shows exactly which vials went missing and when." "Whatever you believe about the Deathless Man's nature, Inquisitor, attempted murder using stolen temple resources is not a matter of doctrine. It is a matter of law, and I intend to see it prosecuted as such." The council chamber erupted into the particular chaos of powerful people realizing, all at once, that the ground beneath them had shifted in ways none of them had fully accounted for. Some elders sided immediately with Aeneas, seeing in Halvern's overreach a chance to check an inquisitor who had grown too comfortable wielding doctrine as a weapon. Others clung to the older certainty that the chalice's infallibility was too foundational to question, and that questioning it, however inconvenient the evidence, was itself the greater heresy. Kieran was not present for the argument. Aeneas had insisted, correctly, that his presence would turn a legal question into a spectacle, but he felt its consequences within days, in the sudden and unmistakable thinning of temple attention directed his way, in the careful new distance certain former pursuers kept from Lyra's laboratory, in the quiet arrival of a formal notice from the council itself. Pending further investigation, the Deathless Man was to be considered a protected witness rather than a fugitive, his status suspended rather than resolved. It was not safety, it was something more useful than safety, time. He used it, in the weeks that followed, the way a man builds a wall, one stone at a time, without any illusion that the work was close to finished. Lyra's research expanded from cataloging his immunities to theorizing, carefully, about their origin, an inheritance from a prior existence, she'd come to believe, based on fragments he'd shared of memories that did not belong to this world's history, this world's cities, this world's gods. "Your body remembers something it shouldn't be able to remember," she told him one evening, surrounded by ledgers that had grown into an entire shelf dedicated solely to his condition. Not knowledge, instinct, a foundation laid down somewhere else, in some other life, that this world's poisons simply weren't built to break. "I don't think the chalice failed by accident, Kieran. I think it failed because it was never designed to account for a body that had already survived something worse. Worse than a poison built by gods? I don't know what could be worse than that," Lyra admitted. "But something was. Something in whatever you were before you were this. I intend to find out what, given enough time and considerably more of your blood than you've probably budgeted for." Selena, for her part, made good on the quieter debt of a life saved, not through grand gestures which would have drawn exactly the kind of attention neither of them could afford, but through small, careful acts of protection that only someone with real imperial authority could provide. A guard rotation quietly adjusted near Lyra's laboratory, a rumor deliberately seeded through the right salons to make Kieran's continued survival seem less like a threat to the established order and more like an asset worth imperial protection. "You realize," she told him, during one of the increasingly frequent evenings she found reason to visit, ostensibly to check on her own lingering recovery, "that my grandmother has begun asking pointed questions about whether the man who saved my life might also be useful in negotiations with the Southern Territories." Immunity to poison is a rather valuable trait to advertise to people who like to solve political disagreements with a well-placed assassination. "I'm beginning to understand that being useful and being safe are, as you warned me, not remotely the same thing." "No," Selena agreed, something almost fond creeping into her usual careful diplomacy. "But you've survived worse odds than court politics already. I find I'm no longer as worried for you as I probably should be." Even Anya, in her own careful way, had begun to extend something beyond mere legal protection, a genuine, growing curiosity about what his existence meant for a faith she had spent her whole life serving, softened by weeks of conversation that had shifted, gradually, from interrogation into something closer to partnership. I still don't know what you are in the eyes of the gods, she told him during one of their now regular meetings in the temple annex. Miracle, mortal anomaly, or something my faith has no name for yet, but I've decided it no longer frightens me the way it once did. Perhaps that, in itself, is its own kind of answer. The golden text at the edge of Kieran's vision had grown into something like a quiet companion over these weeks, a steady, patient accounting of everything the world had tried to use against him and everything it could no longer use again. Absolute immunity. Immunities registered, 16. Passive effect, unlocked. Minor physical fortification. Accumulated immunity has begun strengthening baseline resilience. 16 immunities, and something new beneath them now, a passive strength he hadn't asked for and didn't fully understand. The first evidence that his condition was not merely defensive, but cumulative, building towards something Lyra had begun, in her more excitable moments, to call an inevitability rather than an accident. Selena visited the laboratory that evening, a rare enough occurrence that Lyra actually looked up from her ledgers in surprise, trading a glance with Kieran that suggested she, too, understood the significance of an imperial princess choosing to walk into a converted bathhouse in the Tannery district rather than summon him to the palace. The council's ruling will reach the public within the week, Selena said, settling into the one chair in the laboratory not currently buried under paperwork. My grandmother is already recalculating her position. A temple weakened by internal scandal is a temple more dependent on imperial goodwill to maintain order, which means, rather inconveniently for your preference for a quiet life, that you have just become considerably more valuable to her plans than you were a month ago. I'm beginning to suspect quiet was never truly on offer, Kieran said. No, Selena agreed, something almost gentle in her usual careful diplomacy. But for what it's worth, and I recognize it may not be worth much, given everything this month has cost you, I don't think you're being used the way my grandmother imagines. Halvern is exposed. Ania's position is strengthened rather than destroyed. Lyra has answers she'd have spent a lifetime chasing otherwise. Whatever else this has cost you, Kieran Vase, you've changed more in this city in a month than most reformers manage in a decade of careful, patient work. Lyra, from behind her ledgers, made a small, satisfied sound of agreement and did not look up. He stood at the window of the laboratory that had become, against every plan he'd made the night he fled a temple cell, something dangerously close to a home. An alchemist bent over her ledgers behind him, a princess's careful protection extended over him from the palace above, a high priestess quietly reconsidering 3 decades of certainty on his behalf, and understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had run out of places left to run, that whatever came next would not be decided by his hiding. It would be decided by what he chose to become, now that hiding was no longer an option. Below, in the city, the whispers about the deathless man had begun to shift from fear into something more dangerous to the old order: hope. And somewhere in the temple's deepest sanctum, Inquisitor Halvern, humiliated but not yet broken, stripped of authority but not of conviction, had already begun writing to allies in the temple's outer provinces, seeking support for a war his own council had refused to sanction. The first crack in the gods' monopoly on judgment had been made. What Kieran had not yet understood, what none of them had yet understood, was how many more cracks were waiting beneath the surface of an empire built on the quiet assumption that its poisons, its curses, and its gods were beyond question. Far to the north, in a provincial temple outpost that answered only nominally to the capital's council, a rider arrived bearing Halvern's sealed message and found, waiting to receive it, a circle of inquisitors who had never fully trusted the capital's growing softness on doctrine to begin with. They read his account of the deathless man with the particular hunger of zealots who had long suspected the world was overdue for a reckoning of its own, and began, that same night, drafting plans the capital's council would not learn of for months. And in the imperial palace, the old empress herself received a private report on the Autumn Accord's aftermath, read it twice by candlelight, and set it down with the quiet, calculating satisfaction of a ruler who has just watched a new and valuable piece appear on a board she had been playing for 30 years. A piece, she noted with some private amusement, that neither the temple nor her own granddaughter yet fully understood they were both trying to claim. Kieran knew none of this yet. He knew only the golden ledger glowing faintly behind his eyes, the quiet laboratory around him, and the strange, unfamiliar shape of a life that had somehow, against every plan he'd made in a temple cell, begun to feel worth protecting rather than merely surviving. He was about to find out exactly how much that life would cost him. End of Book 1.